Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome. I'm Richard Blanco, and this is Ben Beadle, who is CEO of the National Residential Landlords Association. Now, Vanessa normally does the Landlord Lens podcast stroke webinar, isn't
That's
it? I
right,
guess,
yeah.
But
I thought you'd had a sex change, Vanessa. Is
well,
that not what it is? Vanessa's let herself go.
I was going to wear a blonde
right?
wig just to kind of, go with the flow, but Vanessa can't be here, unfortunately, today because she's not well. So I'm sitting in, and but I'm going to be doing what Vanessa usually does, and we're going to be in conversation together about a few topics. I thought we'd look at the Renters' Rights Bill and its progress in the House of Lords and what the NRLA are hoping might happen as it makes its way through. We'll also look at some of the things that are really annoying landlords in the Renters' Rights Bill and be interested to get Ben's thoughts on that. We'll also look at the MEES consultation, that's around energy efficiency in the private rented sector, because there are a few things in that we've been somewhat alarmed by, and the consultation's still open until the 2nd of May, so there's an opportunity for you to say what you think to government. And then we'll probably also touch on issues like supply, affordability issues around mortgages and so on, and construction costs, which I know are causing some alarm with landlords. And we might even touch on things like making tax digital to see how people are feeling about that, because that's actually coming down the road. And
Let's not depress them too much.
No, sorry. We will. Yes, there'll be some light moments in there. I promise.
One hopes. One hopes.
And I will probably play devil's advocate a bit as well, just to kind of work through some of the arguments for you. But Ben, let's start first of all with the Renters' Rights Bill. And I was looking, in fact, at the three things that are exercising landlords most. I was looking at NRLA research on this, in fact. One of them is the fact that the amount of arrears that the tenant has to be in is going to be 3 months rather than 2 months.
Yep.
And I know that's something that the NRLA has spoken to ministers about,
That's
I
right.
believe.
Yes, that's right.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, why has the government extended that? It seems really unfair, particularly given that without court reform, the whole process is going to take longer anyway.
No, exactly right. I mean, I just think it sends, as I said earlier, for those that were listening into my panel, I think it sends totally the wrong message. It's not a robust ground at all. Landlords cannot take action until they're 4 months down. I mean, that's just nonsense. It's an absolute nonsense. And, it sends the wrong message in as much as that it's kind of okay that, oh, well, you're 4 months down, you've got a window. Well, that tenancy's already failed, whether it's 3 or 4 months in my view. And actually, I don't think you're helping anybody. So we're talking to, I forget which peer it is now, but we're talking to a peer about an amendment. I'd like to see both changed. I'd like to see the notice back to what it was, and
which was 2 weeks,
which was
become
2
4
weeks.
weeks, or becoming 4 weeks.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I'd like to see the threshold reduced as well. I guess the rationale for it is simply to move the pressure away from renters onto landlords. I can't see that there's any other rationale for it.
It does feel gratuitous, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
Yes, and it doesn't take account of the struggles that landlords face in those situations, because they're having to pay mortgages very often. And for those of you who've had a tenant who stops paying, and I've been in that situation, it's horrendously stressful. And the thought that somebody's in your property, you can't get in there, you don't know what they're doing, they're not paying you any rent, you're still paying the mortgage. It seems ministers just don't understand this.
Well, I think they do understand. I think they're just taking I think they're just taking a particular stance, to be honest with you. And Pennycook talks about really decisively levelling up housing and swinging the pendulum back towards renters, but it's just madness in my view. You wouldn't walk into a supermarket and say, I'll pay you 4 months later. You get nicked for shoplifting.
Yes.
And I don't see why this is any different. Now, I understand that we've got some real issues in our housing sector. We've got a lack of social housing. We've got 1.5 million people on social housing waiting lists. We've got temporary accommodation at record levels and at record spend. But why did government pick an argument over something like that? Why do we not do things like increase local housing allowance or unfreeze local housing allowance and things like that. You know, it just seems to be a very vindictive policy in my view.
It can feel like a distraction tactic, can't it?
Yes,
you know,
that's right.
Actually, the problem is years of poor policy, but let's just pick an argument with landlords
that's right,
here.
that's right.
And because the government has the power and a huge majority, it can do that. And Pennycook, of course, is Matthew Pennycook, the Housing and Planning Minister, who is in charge of a lot of this and very much being the kind of front person
Yes.
on it, isn't he?
And to be fair, you know, he's engaged very well on this. You know, I've had several conversations with Matthew, and he's a good politician. What people may not know is that he spent several years. He was the shadow minister, so he's had a long build up to this. But he also worked under Karen Buck. Used to be, I think, Westminster North. Very nice lady. We got on very well with her. But he was a parliamentary assistant to her. He knows housing very, very well. Just comes at things from a slightly different perspective, unfortunately.
Yes, and Karen Buck was not particularly pro private rented sector, was she? And yes,
she was responsible for the Homes Fit for Human Habitation
Oh, that's right,
bill, and
yes.
she's now a peer. I think she's now Baroness. Somebody or other.
Another issue close to Matthew Pennycook's heart is this: the changes to Section 13, which is where the notice period will become 2 months rather than 1 month, and tenants will have the right to go to a tribunal, which they have at the moment, but the rent that the tribunal decides will be applicable from the date of the hearing, rather than the date when you actually issue the Section 13. Or the date suggested on the Section 13 for the increase. Now, he says that he wants to see more tenants going to tribunal. Right. And of course, we know what's going to happen. There won't be enough resources at tribunal. So we're all going to be waiting a year for rent increases to be processed.
And of course, you know, what it also does, the way that it's configured, is it delays as you rightly observed, it delays the rent increase from coming in. And so it's not to say there's a disincentive, but there's actually an incentive for renters to appeal their case, to potentially delay the impact of that rent increase taking effect. And again, that's just one of those things that I just don't think is fair and reasonable in the circumstance. You know, we know that many landlords actually, I know it feels controversial to say it, but landlords are really poor at putting their rents up. Part of the challenge for us is actually, you know, rents have come so far out of kilter that landlords now feel the need to not just increase by 3 or 4%, but to increase it by, you know, 200 or 300 quid. And that is a problem. And I understand that's a problem. And
well, 8 in 10 landlords, according to NRLA research, have at least one tenant that's paying well below market rent. And I know it's a problem that I've had as well.
That's right. And even the English Housing Survey shows that actually most landlords rarely put the rent up once the tenancy is in train. They just reset it when it comes to the market. And so I think, you know, as we go forward and as the bill becomes an act, I think it's going to be incumbent on landlords to really get their ducks in a row about how they manage their tenancies. Nobody's thanking you for not putting your rent up for 10 or 12 years.
Isn't that, so for me, the number one takeaway from all of this is that you guys are amazing, and thank you so much, because without you we'd be lost. The number one takeaway from the renters' rights, all the detail, is I've got to put my rent up now. Before it comes in, I've got to start from the highest baseline I can start from, because anything once it's in is going to be more of a challenge.
Let me just pause you there. We haven't got a roving mic, so we may not be able to pick up all of that. But for the benefit of the recording, the suggestion was that we might encourage people to put their rents up straight away. I don't want to play into sort of the left's hand and make recommendations like that. You will do what's right for your business. What I'm saying is, as you manage your tenancies in a new regime, you will have to manage them in a different way. And so, you know, if you do find yourself in the position of not having raised your rent for 12 or 15 years, actually, probably the worst thing you can go and do is to bring that up to market rent right now. Actually, what you want to do is have a sensible conversation with your tenant. And I mentioned this, Richard, in my panel this morning, which was, I think, your soft skills and actually being able to communicate with your tenants very effectively are going to become increasingly important when this bill becomes an act. Because actually, you know, we hear talk about financial evictions. You know, you may well have seen this phrase bandied about. And actually, I do think there is a role now for landlords to really think very carefully about how they manage their properties, how they manage their tenants and their tenancies, and things like rent increases will come into that.
And one of the things I've done is given people a lot of notice, like 6 months notice, and said, look, I'm really sorry, but your rent is really far below market rent, and can we have a discussion about this? And I'm having this discussion now, 6 months ahead of your renewal. So I think that's a good way to start. And some of that, I'm sure you will be in the same situation, is because mortgages have gone up so much.
Indeed.
Some of mine have quadrupled, and my rents have not kept up with market rents. And a lot of us are in that situation, aren't we? And
well, and of course, you know, that's exacerbated. And I got a question earlier, Richard, about Section 24 and the ability to offset your mortgage interest. You know, I think there's a school of thought out there that landlords are you know, sitting back and just waiting for the money to roll in as some sort of, you know, passive income that we do bugger all. And honestly, there's nothing that irritates me more than that lazy, you know, stereotype. That is absolutely not the case. And you've only got to look at, you know, various Twitter feeds of particular renter organisations to see that is just what they think. They have no concept of the fact that some of the changes that we've seen over the past decade are actually contributing to rents being this high. You know, rent profits and margins are at record lows, around 4%, according to Savills. So there isn't a lot of profit there, but there is a lot of cost. And you know, that's taxation, that's regulation, as well as the cost of borrowing, and we need to be able to have a proper debate about some of those things.
Well, actually, let me ask you about that, Ben. And we've talked about this before. Is campaigning around Section 24 dead? I mean, Section 24 is essentially a 20% tax on your finance costs for people who are higher rate taxpayers. So landlords are in the very unusual position of being taxed on their turnover rather than on their profits, and it pushes some landlords into losing all of their profits, indeed paying more tax than they make in profits. It's incredibly unfair, but of course now is probably not a good time to be chewing the Chancellor's ear about this, is it?
I mean, it won't stop us, but you know, I think we have to be realistic in the circumstances. I should add, it was the Tories that brought it in, which in itself is a surprise, one might say. So it would be unusual to think that a more socialist-leaning government might reverse that with all of the optics around it. But I do think, you know, we continue to make the case, Richard, for pro-growth tax measures, because when it comes to housing, whether it's social housing or whether it's private housing, there is always some sort of subsidy somewhere. You know, somebody has to build those houses. It's taxpayers that builds those social homes. And the one thing I would say is I think a responsible private rented sector, a properly regulated private rented sector, can actually deliver housing far more quickly than you know, social providers. So you know, and it's not just about mortgage interest; it's about barriers to investment.
Yes,
things like stamp
additional
duty.
stamp duty, which has gone up from 3% to 5%. Now, the message that government seem to be sending is that they want to build 1.5 million more homes. They want to encourage councils to build more housing, although they haven't provided much funding for that yet. And they sort of don't really care about the fact there's a supply problem in the private rented sector. They hope that more home ownership will just kind of mean that the rent supply issue just kind of goes away. What's happening there? What are politicians thinking, Ben? It seems mad to us, but there must be some sense in their madness.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew said to me, you know, when I raised the issue of properties leaving the private rented sector, he used this dreadful phrase that really irritates the hell out of me because it's a gen rent phrase of but that home doesn't just disappear, does it?
Right.
Well, what a bloody stupid response that is. Of course it doesn't disappear. My point here is that we've still got, up until very recently, a dozen people chasing every available private rented sector property. So it's all fine and dandy that a first-time buyer buys that property. I get that. That's a good thing. We want to move people on from, I would think, for those that want to move on from rented accommodation to be able to buy. Fine, I've no problem with that. So I get the house doesn't just disappear, but all the time, and we've had it for some time, we've got a dozen people chasing every available home, and that's one less home that those 12 people are going to be able to chase. Yeah. So actually we do, this isn't about necessarily kind of dissing first-time buyers at all. It's a reality check for me to say, well, we need more social housing, we need more private rented housing, and we need housing of all varieties. We're not in the fortuitous position of being, having particular segments that need more than others. We need more of everything.
Well, he seems to ignore the affordability constraints around getting mortgages, doesn't he? And also the fact that the private rented sector is where students tend to go to, people changing jobs, when people get married or divorced or leave home for whatever reason. So we're always going to need a private rented
100%.
sector. And yet the government seems to have a bit of a blind spot around that, which is frustrating.
It seems to me, Richard, that they would rather pay for temporary accommodation than they would to actually have some sort of sensible encouragement to allow investors to come into the market. Yeah. Why is that such a bad thing? Why are we anti-investment? And you've only got to look at the Chancellor. She's talking about pro-growth things. Well, why can't we apply that to housing?
Another blind spot, it seems to me, is that it's seen as vulgar to profit from housing.
Yes.
That seems to be part of the kind of British psyche from the Victorian era, and so not sure we're ever going to get rid of that, but that's very frustrating.
It's a straightforward left versus right issue.
Okay.
In my view, it's a culture war playing out. That actually, if you've got more than one property, that somehow that is, you're just hoarding housing and you're preventing others from being able to acquire that property. It won't surprise you to know that I don't share that view.
Yeah.
I think if you've got responsible investment, that's a good thing. But what those types of groups will absolutely rally at is the idea of making a sustainable profit off the back of it. There's no such thing as a free lunch in this business. Somebody's got to pay for housing somewhere.
Of course.
Fact.
And why is it okay if I set up a plumber's merchants or a grocery store, but it's not okay if I set up a business renting homes to people? It's very frustrating.
But also, if you consider it from a social housing perspective, what these groups miss is that social housing providers actually need to turn a surplus so that they can reinvest in their stock. And actually, if you look at some of the horror stories coming out of local authorities, there was one 2 weeks ago. I can't remember if I mentioned it. The guys that fitted the windows inside out on a tower block. Do you see that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah,
Wow.
I mean,
Wow.
to talk about not being able to organise a good drink in a drinking establishment.
Well, I certainly get a lot of complaints from neighbours who are council and housing association tenants, and some housing associations do a very good job, of course, but it's wrong to sort of suggest one is good and the other is bad, of course, isn't it?
No, and it's exactly the same with private landlords as well. We've got good and bad of all sorts. We don't shy away from those bad landlords, but what we want to do is to make sure that we can promote and talk up good practice like any other sector, but we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It feels to me that government has got comfortable with kind of seeing landlords as one particular group of people, rather than recognising, actually, guys, successive governments have flogged off social housing. 50% of people in the private rented sector are claiming benefits of some sort. Actually, the private investor is picking up the slack where you guys have failed.
Yeah.
So don't kick it.
No, and it seems to me it's government by dogma, really, and stereotype, really, rather than looking at the nuances and complexities and the positive work that we do in our sector. Let's just pick out a couple more things from the Renters' Rights Bill. one of the top three that exercises landlords most is the landlord circumstance ground, which is where you won't be able to sell or move in until the tenant's been in for 12 months and you have to give 4 months notice, and then you won't be able to let the property out again for I believe it's 6 months.
Yeah,
yes.
there's it may even be a year. I can't
It
remember.
may be a
but-
year, or suddenly I've forgotten it. Yes.
I mean, so in terms of the sales ground, so I would say this, you know, as investors, as people that are in the market for a particular reason, I don't think you just wake up and think, I need to sell it. We've got to be better than that. And so that's why I think, you know, I think you can plan around that kind of freezing out.
Yeah.
What I don't think is reasonable is if, having done that, and I think I'm certain it's 12 months,
Yes.
that you might have a change of circumstances in terms of selling. I don't know, whatever. That you can't then let that property for a year. That would all be fine if we had loads and loads of homes. But I just find it, you know, rich beyond measure that that, you know, organisations like Shelter would rather have a property sat empty for a year than actually be able to house somebody in a housing crisis. I know they don't house people anyway, but actually prohibiting people from being housed
Yes.
is
Enforced emptiness of homes.
yeah, exactly
Yes,
right.
yeah,
It's
this is
absolute
crazy.
nonsense. So I mean, I understand why there needs to be a window or a short window. Under the Renters Reform Bill, that was 3 months.
Yes,
I thought that was fair and reasonable in the attractive so that people don't misuse the ground. But to keep your property empty, and it would be an attract a fine as well, a significant
Yes, of
fine
course.
if you did do that. I don't think that's normal.
And of
at
course,
all.
Shelter would argue that it's to prevent landlords from gaming the system and using this as a sort of backdoor Section 21. The final issue on Renters' Rights Bill I wanted to bring up was the student properties issue, which is where there will be a student grounds around tenancies ending between June and September, where the landlord would have to give 4 months' notice, I believe, for that, isn't it? But that will only apply to HMOs, which seems
Yeah.
very odd, and I don't know why that's been picked out of the ether. What is wrong with 1 and 2 bedroom flats and studio flats, indeed?
It's just to limit it. I spoke with Matthew about this particular point, and I suspect that well, yes, I suspect / know that I think he allowed that ground with some resistance. So, you know, he's been very clear that he doesn't want the student market to not receive all of the benefits, in inverted commas, of the Renters' Rights Bill. And so he hinted that that might be a ground in time that gets re-reviewed out. Now, I think the situation has changed since then, because we're talking with peers about amending that ground so that it does apply to a wider demographic of 1 and 2 beds. Essentially, if you're a student, and I get it has to be all or nothing, you can't have mixed households.
Yeah.
But if you're a student, you want to, twofold, as a landlord, you want to preserve the student cycle as much as possible, and you need certainty about when that property is going to become available again. But as a renter, it applies the same way, not so much to the people that are leaving, but for the people that are looking. And I think that what we're going to see if this bill comes in unchanged is student renters absolutely beside themselves about not being able to find accommodation. And of course, that ground is only applicable as it stands if it's not, I think, if it's 6 months prior, isn't it? You can't do it you can't create a tenancy earlier than 6 months in order to use it. So they're trying to, you know, cool down the student market and really, really change it. I have to say, Richard, I don't think the student market is broken.
No.
But I think it runs the risk of being broken.
Yes, and you know, many would argue it's relatively functional with that mixture of purpose-built and then private rented sector, which is often very carefully regulated
Indeed.
by universities, actually, and also, of course, by local authorities with the licensing
Absolutely.
processes. Yes. Well, the other side of that, of course, is this 2 months where it's going to be a rolling, ongoing, periodic tenancy, and there's nothing to stop tenants giving notice on the day they move in effect creating a 2 months tenancy
That's
agreement.
right.
And that could leave student landlords in the lurch, particularly, couldn't it, if your tenant moves in October and then moves out in December, and you can't get another student that will want to do the remaining kind of 6 months.
So I think this is where, who operates in the student market out of interest? A few of you, yeah. So I think this is where you will change your business models. I think that you will put your Mystic Meg hat on and kind of predict when people are likely to leave. You'll be using your having a regular dialogue with renters to try and understand and predict that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, if you're worried that a property is going to be empty for 2 or 3 months, I suggest you try and factor that in as much as you can. And this is why I say that I think you know, it is going to be quite costly for renters as people find their feet in the new regime, because none of this is going to make the cost of renting cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, talking of new expense, let's talk about the new minimum energy efficiency standards that are being consulted
They just love
on.
spending our money, don't they? They just love spending our money. But
So,
it's fun to spend other people's money.
The proposal here is that landlords will have to spend up to £15,000 on each property to get it up to an EPC C by 2030. It could be by 2028 if it's for new tenants, but 2030 for existing tenants. We don't know what the regulations will be until the end of 2026. There are 2.5 million properties in the private rented sector that need upgrading to C or above. And the methodology might also be changed, so we're not sure about that. There's also a huge lack of tradespeople. Something like 166,000 shortage of tradespeople at the moment, and the NRLA has suggested that 5,000 properties per working day will need to be retrofitted or refurbished to get up to standard between now and 2030. So all sounds like a bit of a mess.
Well, I mean, it's unachievable, isn't it? You know, it's unachievable. I don't think anybody's kind of, you know, saying, oh, hold on a minute, you know, we don't want to kind of improve energy efficiency throughout the country. But actually we're saying, okay, if you want to single out housing on this, you need to give the sector a bit more time. You need to give the sector some financial support, and you need to be realistic about what can be done with the available resources that we have. So we're actually talking to the Energy Minister, regular discussions. We've had, I think, half a dozen or so very constructive roundtables on a whole range of different themes, including affordability. And out of all of the you know, the conversations we're having, we're hearing some helpful noises off. As I say, this is a consultation. Was it the 2nd of May it closes?
Yes, I think so, yes.
So for those of you kind of with concerns about this, look at the consultation. There's a blog on the NRLA site with a link to it as well. And you know, share your opinion on the consultation. As I say, this is not that we don't want to do it, but I think it could be done as ever in a far more practical and sensible way. With some support and a longer lead-in period.
Yeah, I was going to say a longer time scale. Do you think 10 years? Do you think D by 2030, C by 2035? I know the NRLA hasn't sort of nailed its
colours to
the mast exactly, but those are the sorts of things one might interpret from what the NRLA is saying.
So, I mean, the other thing, Richard, is they're saying that so we won't know the full detail until late 2026. And that means that kind of any costs that might need to be incurred will reasonably be held off until 2026. So one of the things that we would like to see is this stuff's going to happen, and whether it's 15 or whether it's 10,000 and whether it's on a tapered basis, you know, those are all things that we're talking to government about at the moment. But actually, rather than create a kind of deadline from which you can start to spend. Why not say, right, any energy expenditure that you've made in the past 5 years counts towards that 15,000 cap, and anything that we do whilst we work out the detail also counts to it.
Yeah.
Why not nudge people for the, you know, in the right sort of way? Because when it comes to the EPC, many landlords are frustrated by the EPC because it's no longer fit for purpose. So actually, the consultation is trying to address that. I think that should be welcomed. But alongside that, it's about how we decarbonise and how we, you know, improve the energy efficiency of those homes, and how we do it in a way that doesn't kind of cut your nose off to spite your face. Because, you know, we give the example, don't we, of kind of being in the northeast of England, having a low asset value, having to spend £15,000. Well, that's a straightforward financial decision that says, ain't going to work. That property gets sold, one less property in the private rented sector. It probably goes to the owner-occupied sector. They don't need to do anything with the energy efficiency of that home, so nobody's any further forward.
Yes.
And so actually, you know, I don't mind stick, but we don't very often see carrot, and I think we need to see far more carrot on some of these things.
Yes, I mean, there are some government grants at the moment available through local authorities, but they're quite limited. And the government has also suggested that 15,000 could be lowered to 10,000 for those properties that receive less rent or are less valuable.
Correct.
It has to be said, this is one of the reasons why landlords say that they might sell up before the end of the decade.
Yep.
According to NRLA research, 66% of landlords expect to still be in the business by the end of this decade. That leaves a whole third that might not be, and this is one of the reasons why they don't really want to stick around. And of course, there's that. I'm somebody who might have to spend up to 200,000 on my properties, actually.
Wow.
And I'm not sure I'm going to get any return on my investment.
Should we all have a whip round for you?
Yes,
Anyone got a
please.
hat? Borrow your hat and we'll put some coins in it.
It just makes you think, is it worth it, doesn't it? And I'm probably of that generation that's been a landlord for 20 years. So I'm starting to think, well, I'm not sure really if I want to spend all of that on.
You had hair before you became a landlord, didn't
I did,
you?
yes. Well, I've also got making tax digital coming down the line as well. What do you think about this, Ben? This is where from next April, those of us who have profits of more than 50,000, or it might be turnover actually of more than 50,000, turnover, isn't it? Yes, will have to do quarterly tax returns using software that's approved by HMRC, and it's going to bring into scope those with 30,000 the following year, and then those with 20,000 the year after. So I think we've all got our head in the clouds around this, haven't we? Because not many people know about it.
No, I mean, to be fair, it's been on the long finger for some time.
Yes,
so one of our successes was to get it pushed back this far.
That's
to be
true,
honest
yes,
with you,
of course.
It's come around a bit too quick. I haven't really got much to add on this, other than to say, you know, it's been a long time in the planning.
Yeah.
One thing I would say though is, for those of you that are using Portfolio, our property management software, we will be upgrading that to make sure that it can cope with the demands of making tax digital. So that's about tracking your expenditure. And you know, submitting your returns. So that's something that we're working on at the moment. In terms of the sort of thresholds, I think they've long been established, Richard. So this stuff is unfortunately happening.
It's happening. We've just got to get our heads around it. Yeah.
And start saving up, keeping those receipts.
Okay. Well, do we have any questions from the audience that we'd like to put to Ben? Anyone got any questions? Yes, gentleman over here.
Ben, if you're a betting man, when do you say this renters' rights bill's coming in, and will it definitely apply to all existing tenancies, or will it be?
Yeah. So the way that the renters' rights bill will work is, it will be kind of almost an ongoing period of pain for probably about a couple of years. So I would expect the King to sign this into law before, maybe around the summer, or a bit before. What that means though is it won't happen on day one. There will be a commencement date that's set, so there will be a window between royal assent and commencement. We think that should be a 6-month window, because there will be things that you folk need to do, that everybody needs to do. I don't know exactly what yet, but you're gonna have to issue documentation to all of your current tenants. Now, good news is we're going to provide that. Who's an NRLA member here? Yeah. Who's not an NRLA member? Right, lock the door. Lock the door. Don't let her escape. All right, coming after you. But we will be providing all of that collateral to make sure that folk can comply. But this only means the kind of tenancy reform element, the abolition of the fixed term, the abolition of Section 21, the new grounds. Things like Awab's law, the Decent Home Standard, the Ombudsman will follow in time. So our best bet is that it's going to be probably October, November time when it comes in. We are talking very, very regularly with government about enforcement and about commencement and implementation, because actually the issue is not so much small landlords. The issue is actually bigger agents. If you've got 100,000, tenancies under management, you're going to be busy, and you're going to have to do that within 30 days. So, or you get a wretched great fine. So we're talking to government about how implementation might work. My preference, in answer to your question, would have been to do exactly what we had negotiated under the Renters Reform Bill, which is to say new tenancies from this date, and when court capacity is able to kind of deal with the inevitable flow, then we're bringing existing tenancies. But on commencement, if you've got a fixed term, that will be undone. It will become a periodic tenancy. And that's going to be a significant change.
It's a cliff edge, isn't it?
It is a cliff edge,
Ben,
yeah.
yes. And, in the original version of the Renters Reform Bill, it was there was a year's gap,
That's
wasn't
right.
there, before all old tenancies became the new type of tenancy.
And that just, helps people get it right, which is what we want to do. We
There's
don't want
no question of getting that from government, though, is there?
No.
They're really determined to do that cliff edge, yeah.
They are,
yeah.
unfortunately. So this is about how long we've got between royal assent and commencement, and making sure that you've got all of the tools that you need in order to be able to comply.
I heard rumours that might get pushed back to April, but I don't think there's anything concrete on that, is there?
So, maybe early 26.
Right.
But that is a
we just
vicious
don't know, do
rumour.
we? No.
It's a
Yes,
vicious
it's a
rumour.
vicious rumour. There you go. Where did I hear that?
Probably from me.
Might have been the head of policy. Any more questions? We've got time for. We've got 3 all of a sudden.
Yeah,
Go on
wow.
then, gentleman, right at the back.
Yes, I've been in this landlord game for about 35 years, and I have to say I find it really quite difficult times at the moment. I mean, one thing I'm very interested in, whether it's Section 24, whether it's EPCs, whether it's Renters' Rights Bill, everybody seems to be against the private landlord. One reads in the paper that the government is very keen on enhancing the build-to-rent sector. Do you think it is the case that government actually would like to see the back of private landlords?
What they like and what they want are two different things, because I think private landlords, whether they like it or not, are going to be here in 20, 30 years' time. There might be fewer of us, but the build-to-rent sector makes up a piddly part of the overall private rented sector, and they have the same challenges that we have about getting things to stack up. So, yes, I see that as a growth area, but we're talking a couple of percent at best in terms of the overall kind of housing mix. The one thing I think we can do better at is actually, the criticism that we get levied at us is that we're buying up lots of other homes. We're not necessarily creating new homes, and so one of the things that I think that that we could have a better story on is those sort of individuals that are developing land that are bringing new homes back, bringing old homes or old buildings back into residential
Yes.
use. But I do share your
Yes, because many of us
sentiment.
buy at wrecks at auction and bring them back into use,
Indeed.
and that's not a story we hear much, is it?
No, it's not.
Quick questions from Will. We're really short of time, and I had 2 here. I think I'm just going to have to take these soon. Yes.
Yeah, are you going to be producing new tenancy agreements?
Yes.
And if
That's
so,
a
when
quick
do
yes,
that
I think. Yeah.
So, well, when we know the final detail.
There was rumours before that we'd have to do this by June some time ago. Is that?
So I don't think so. I think so the next stage of the bill's progress is the 22nd of April, where it gets kind of a line-by-line review in the Lords, and that goes on until the 6th of May. So I don't think it's going to be June by any stretch. I think it's going to be probably the autumn at the earliest. When we know what we're dealing with, we'll make sure you've got all of the tenancy agreements, notices, whatever it is that you need to comply. But we need to know what they are
first. A final quick question, I think, was it from you? Yes.
Making tax digital, the turnover over 50k, is it per property or the combined turnover for the property?
It's overall, yes, combined.
If you register each property against separately in the company?
So, well, that's a different entity. So there's a really good blog on the NRLA site that went out a couple of days ago that has got all of the detail that you need to know about making tax digital. That would be on an entity basis. So you kind of have to, that would be one, that would be another. I guess the 50,000 combined is if I'm not incorporated and I've got a number of properties, that's what it.
I'm really sorry, everyone. We've come to the end of our time. So
we're
thank
being
you
booted
very
out.
much.
We're getting evicted.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thanks to our audience.